In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Christ is in our midst. So we hear today this gospel reading of the prodigal son, and we hear about how this son, the younger son, takes all his inheritance. He goes out and he wastes it and lives a terrible life, squanders everything, and then realizes that he is empty and has nothing left. And I was thinking about it today, and I was thinking, really, how many of us have asked for our inheritance from our families and taken that and wasted it and are completely lost? And what is really the contemporary understanding that we could take away from this particular gospel reading? And as I was thinking about it, it made me think specifically about how we try to justify things and how we try to weasel out of things. You know, there's nobody that I've encountered in a scholastic setting who said, "Gee, teacher, professor, whatever, can we have some more homework? Can you please assign us something that's very difficult to do?" Or readings. And usually that was the punishment for a class that had done something wrong, right? I mean, you go into class and the teacher says, "Does anybody know what we're talking about today?" And everybody looks with that deer in the headlight look, you know, especially if it was an evening course. And then they say, "Well, okay, so since you didn't know that, I want you to read the next 200 pages of whatever it was." And I remember we had one particular professor in the seminary who had that keenly vindictive way about assigning things. But really, the opposite is what we want. The opposite many times in society tells us we have to do the opposite of that. Ask for more, do less. Put less effort in, expect more results. Isn't that what everything is pitched as far as exercise machines, as far as medications, as far as just about everything that we see? Do I work so hard? You know, it's very interesting, too, with telephones these days, or cellular devices as they're called. We look at it, and if you get bad reception, you're getting 2 bars, and you're like, "Man, it's so slow, I can't handle this," right? I gotta get moving. And you think about it, and that's faster than what we were 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And we want less effort and more result. So how do we today become, unfortunately, the prodigal? Well, as a priest, I see many times that people will come forward and say, "Father, I just, Sunday mornings, it's my day off. It's my day to rest. I'm not into it, and can you just, let me go do this on Sunday mornings? Or I don't feel like praying, and I only pray a couple times a month. Is that okay?" Really looking for justification. I don't like helping other people out, or I don't like giving to the church. I don't like giving my time. I don't like doing all these things. Is that okay for me to do? As if I have this giant Christian seal stamp of apathy, and I can just stamp it and say, "Okay, you're good to go. Go do nothing, and you're going to be all set." And that is not really what we're called to do. And it's a reminder, too, of the gospel reading today, that the prodigal son did what? He left and asked for justification. He asked for his money. He asked to live his own life the way he wanted to. And if you look at the church, so many times throughout the history of the church, and that I've seen as a priest through the years, is people want to do their own thing. "I want to do my own thing, Father. This fasting thing, I don't like it. I got to have my hamburgers on Fridays. Or I got to do this. Or I got to have this or that. And I have to do it because of what? Because we're too weak to submit to God and say, "Okay, let's follow the path of God"? Or is it that we're too stubborn and we say, "This has to be my way or I'm not doing it"? And that's exactly what the prodigal son said. "This has to be my way. You owe me money because I'm your son. So give me the money now and let me do things the way I see fit." So he takes all his inheritance, he goes out, and what happens? He fails. He destroys his life. He becomes a person who is not only a failure, but a person who's barely surviving. And then he looks back at his father and says, he thinks in his memory, he says, you know what? Even the servants of my father had so much more than I have now. The servants of his father, which means, again, that he came from extraordinary wealth. That would be like us today saying that we took all our inheritance from our parents and we were out in the middle of nowhere, we're roaming the streets of Aurora, trying to get a bed at Hesed House, and then we come back and we say to ourselves, gee, even the maids who used to clean or the people who cut the grass at my parents' house had more than me. Let me go ask if I can do that. That's the equivalent of that wealth that he had. But he went out and he wasted it all because he thought he knew better, because he thought he could take that and do something better than what the Father had already established. Now we know that this story is speaking about the Father in heaven, God the Father. And we know that the sons are us. Whether our gender is male or female, both sons are us. So what are we really thinking about today in this parable? How do we identify with this? Well, first thing is, when you look at your life, don't try and slide out of things when it comes to the church. Don't try and slide out and become like the rest of humanity, where the less I do, the better I'll feel. Or the less I do, the more I should be rewarded, because I'm that good. And I think that we see a society full of people saying, I'm that good. And what do we have in the end? We have a society full of people that aren't really that good. But when we look at the church and we look at what the church is calling us to do, it's calling us to be obedient to the life of the church. Now, obedience is something, that's almost like a four-letter word when we say that. Obedient to the church. And people say, oh, come on, Father, I'm going to listen to you. I'm going to listen to what the church tells me to do. I have my own ways of doing things. And people don't want to submit to the life of the church. You know, when a person becomes a monk and they come to submit themselves to the church, they lay flat on the ground. They lay flat on the ground, face first, flat down, to show that submission. When the priest is ordained, he is on not one knee as someone being crowned, but he's on both knees to show humility, and he bends all the way down to submit and to say that he will be obedient to the teachings of the church. But when we're Christians and we're dunked in the baptismal font and we're held by the priest and we're chrismated and we receive Holy Communion, and then we say, you know what, but I was little then. Now I'm so much smarter and I know so many more things, and I don't agree with what the church says about this, or I don't like what the church is telling me to do. It's uncomfortable for me. And many times we have that uncomfortable feeling because we're really trying to pull ourselves away and start our own thing. And when you look at how many churches, you know, when I was talking to the mayor when he came a few weeks ago, I said, how many churches are in Aurora? How many do you think? Well, he said 93 or 94 or something like that. That's a lot of churches. Now, when you think about it, how many are actual churches from the beginning of Christ? That's an easy answer, right? And it's not in the 90s. It's not even in the 20s. It's not even in the 10s. But when we look at why there's so many churches established and all over the world, is because somebody decides, I'm going to start my own church. What's Protestant mean? To protest. You have the word protest in the name. I protest against what is being said. I'm going to start my own thing. If you look at some of the big box churches that are scattered throughout the western suburbs, and one very close to us, one further north, and you look at them and you say, well, where did they start? They started from, I'm going to do what I want to do in the service as a minister, pastor, whatever you want to call them, and I'm going to start something where people who are offended by tradition, where they're bothered by fasting, where they're bothered by prayer, we're going to make it very simple. We're going to have a performance. I'm going to get up and sing. We're going to play the drums. And, you know, I once talked to I wouldn't even call him Protestant, just kind of like a whatever pastor of his own thing. And he's like, well, do you have like drums and bands in your church? I started laughing. I'm like, the only thing we can have is an organ to accompany the choir, and for weddings. There's no trumpets in church. There's no trumpets in weddings. There's no opera singers in weddings. There's no violins in church. There's no DJ lights. You don't hear subwoofers bumping, like you might hear it on the street going down the road, but you're not going to hear it inside the church. So the whole thing is what society has adopted and said, oh, this is a valid church. This is valid. This is valid. This is valid. It's validating, society validates everybody's whims to do everything that they want to do in particular. But what does the Orthodox Church say? The Orthodox Church says, from the words of Christ today, that if we go out and think we know better than God, and if we think we know better than his household that has been established, we will fail. And we will be not only in need, we will be desperate. We will be longing for that tradition, for that faith, for that presence of God. And if you look at now some of the writings and articles that are out, they say people are returning to faith, returning to tradition, because there comes a point where people wake up and they say, you know what, there's no regiment to my life. It's whatever I want. And that's exactly what the devil wants us to do. Do whatever you want to do. And then if you look at the older brother in the parable today, he comes to the father and says, you know what, I've been here the whole time, and you haven't done anything for me. Which to me is the other end of the Christians, the ones who there's the ones who go out and say, I'm going to do my own thing and do whatever I want to do. I'll take what I pick and choose like a giant buffet of the church. I'll take the prayer, I'll take the miracles, skip the stewardship, skip the fasting, and I'll end up with my little platter of whatever I desire. And then there's the people who are sitting there with a giant platter of everything the church says and says, this does nothing for me. It does nothing. And why does the miracle happen to that person? Why does this person receive mercy? And we see that in churches throughout the world. When someone comes in at Easter time or during the Lenten services and they come into your row, God forbid somebody pushes you over 2 feet, right? And then they come over and you're like, who's this person? They never come here. Why did they take my seat? Right? So what happens? What's our response? And I know this. We get every coat possibly available in our household, and what do? We lay them out on the pews, right? This is my pew, and don't come in here, and I don't want any foreigners. And why is that person up in front? They never come to church, and now look at them. They're up in front, right? And I know this happens because some of you tell me. I mean, it's not even hidden. You're like, I can't believe this person bumped me out of my row, and you're like, I came here early, and I put all my coats out. And the rest of my family was supposed to come later, which some of those family members never come anyways, right? We save the coats because they're not here with you. So we look at that and we say, what's our disposition? Is it do whatever I want, judge everybody else, or are we somewhere in the middle where we say, let me just follow the teachings of the church. Let me follow what the church is telling me to do. Let me listen and let me be obedient. And in obedience comes discipline, it comes training, and it comes strength. So those things come through being obedient. Now, not blindly obedient, and I'm not saying that, I'm telling you all to drink Kool-Aid after church and, follow me and do all that. No, this is not like the cults. This is following what God is telling us to do. And to say, can we be obedient to God? Can we listen to what he's telling us and just start trying? Or do we want to do our own thing? That's what this parable is about today. Because we can't enter the Lenten season saying, you know what, fasting is not for me. I don't like fasting. It's somebody else's deal. It's a monastic thing, or it's the yayas or the papus do it, and I'm not going to do it because I need my Buffalo Wild Wings, right? I don't know. I hear these things. But you cannot do that and expect to receive God's grace. You cannot set up your own little church and say, this is how I do things. I don't receive communion because it's too difficult to fast, or I don't feel worthy at all, or whatever the case is. And that goes from both spectrums, from the new in the church to the very old in the church. And there's disobedience on all the levels. So we have to look and say, what is the church calling us to do? Did you know that in the early church, if you missed communion for 3 consecutive services, you were excommunicated? Excommunicated. That was it. You were done. Gone. And the only way you could come back was to come to confession and to come to the priest and say, I didn't come for communion because of this or that. But communion, to refuse communion and to reject it and not receive it for 3 consecutive Sundays or weekdays or whatever the thing was a sign that you disagreed with a theology. So you were excommunicated. Now, today's day and age, we have people that receive all the time who maybe are prepared or not prepared. And we have some people that say, I only receive 3 times a year because that's what my grandmother told my grandmother, and my grandmother told that grandmother, and somebody was related to Moses back in the day or whatever the thing was. And they have their own set theology, and they won't listen. They won't listen to the priest. They won't listen to the church. They won't listen to the canons of the church. So what are we supposed to do? We're going into the fasting period. If you don't like fasting, you don't like orthodoxy, period. If you don't like prayer, you don't like orthodoxy, period. And if you don't like orthodoxy, you don't like the church, and you don't like God. So you have to say, this is difficult for me, this is hard, but it's something I have to do, and I have to try to do. And I'm not asking you all to go and just, buy a hard loaf of bread and chew on that for 40 days. Talk to me if you haven't fasted, and I'll give you a regimen that's manageable but is somewhat challenging so that you can try to grow in fasting. But don't just say, it doesn't count for me. Because when God comes to you and says, would you like to come into the kingdom of heaven? And you say, yeah, that'd be great. I can't wait to be there. And he says, well, a lot of the things you did didn't count. It didn't count. You don't have, well, show me what you did. Show me an effort. Did you try to fast? No. Did you try to pray? Not really. Only when, I prayed when I was in the hospital and I had my appendix taken out. Most people pray when they're staring at fluorescent lights, right? And most people fast when they're staring at fluorescent lights too, right? Or when you have to, it's interesting, people are, can't eat this tomorrow because I have to have surgery. And they go on a special diet. And, for those who have had colonoscopies, you know the whole drill for that, right? You have to go through a whole eating regimen, and it's awful. And then when I say about fasting, people are like, oh, well, fasting, Father. But you'll go through a colonoscopy, you'll drink that, liquid and stuff, and you'll be all over the place. And then you go for a surgery, and then you have to take your heart pills, and you have to eat special diets and broth, and you get your wisdom teeth taken out. You can't drink from a straw, and you got to have, we make all these adjustments for medical things. But when we're spiritually hurting, will we make those adjustments? Will you make those adjustments? So today, we're either one son or the other, or we're in the middle saying, you know what, I'm going to do this. I'm going to walk forward. I'm going to try to fast this year. And don't come to me and say, you know what, Father, I can't fast. Because everybody can fast. Now, to the extent that you fast and how you fast should be dealt with the priest. You should, if you have to take medicine in the morning, I get it. I'm not saying don't take your heart pills or don't take whatever your things are. Or if you're hypoglycemic, that's a different story. Or if you have some other issues, we'll talk about those things. But don't say it doesn't apply to me. Because when we say things don't apply to us, we also look at the kingdom of heaven and say, that doesn't apply to me either. These are the tools to move forward and to grow. And today we learn that when we do things on our own, it leads to destruction. And if we sit there and do nothing, even in the presence of God, in here, in the church, and we just sit and stare, that does nothing either. So challenge yourself. Realize that these things apply to all of us. And they help us. They're not here to hurt us. They're not here to kill us. They're here to give us life. The exact opposite of what the world says. So with that in mind, think of this story of the prodigal and realize that obedience to God means listening to what he says, putting our will in the back, and realizing that God knows everything. So why do we have to rely on ourselves? If God knows everything, if he created everything, if we can't even explain the things he created, then why are we wanting to be in charge? Amen.